Hi, David Vizard here, and you are watching PowerTec10. You'll see a few heads around me here. That's because we're getting ready to do a 10 sets of cylinder head dyno test. Here's our mule motor. It's a 306. There's nothing really special about it except it has Chevy rods in it. We've just got a stock head on there that we are just checking a few things with, but it's a question right now of getting the valve train done and putting the heads on, and this will be ready for the dyno. Then it'll be a hectic 2 weeks while we keep swapping heads and valve trains. We're also going to throw in some carburetor tests and manifold tests on that, so you might want to catch that. What I want to talk about today is some simple mods on cast iron heads, especially the early 289 302 heads that deliver extra power yet are rarely, if ever, talked about. When I say if ever, I've never seen anything either printed or videoed on this, and what we're going to look at is basically just little tweaks on the exhaust from about 1/4 of an inch before the valve seat to about 1/4 of an inch after, the valve itself and the combustion chamber and how to get things going out of the cylinder better, and lastly some detail work that maybe it doesn't contribute towards power, but it helps out just a tad in making the cylinder head a better functioning deal. Let's look at the cosmetics of the cylinder head, because these 289 302 heads are likely to be really old and probably look a bit tacky. And if we're restoring an engine or hopping it up, we probably want to see something that looks good. But let's consider a question here, right? Why iron heads? Why don't we just go ahead and get a set of aluminum heads? Fine, that is a good alternative. And other than the conditions I'm going to talk about now, that's the way I would go. However, think about this. If you're racing, vintage racing, you're stuck. You've got to use a head that's period, right? Secondly, if you're restoring an engine, it's very likely that you're going to want heads of the right period for that restoration. Lastly, you could be one of these undercover road racers, or street racers rather, and you want a stealth motor. Something that on the outside, before you take a bet on whether you're going to beat the other guy or not, looks stock. Well, what could look more stock than a set of 289 heads? Almost every racer out there will think if it's got 289 heads, it is not going to go. Well, let me tell you, my vintage motors on a 2-plane manifold, and that's really the headers and the manifold are the only thing that distinguishes it from being other than stock, makes over 500 horsepower. That's a 289. Imagine that you build, and I've done some heads for a build like this, a 383 inch short deck motor, and it's possible to do that. And then you have a set of these heads on, roller cam, all the good stuff, high compression, the whole 9 yards. It is possible to be looking at somewhere in the region of 525 to 550 horsepower. I'm going to make a bet that anybody that challenges you to a race is not going to figure out that you've got that much power under the hood, especially after having checked the castings to see, yes, that's an iron-headed motor, it can't be that powerful. Well, we'll see. Here then, without further ado, are a few mods that I can recommend, and I'll start off with the cosmetic ones first. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the prime subject of this video, I need to point out a few things that need to be done if you're going to get really serious about making horsepower and modifying the iron heads. First off, it's necessary to machine the guide bosses here to take good late seals, Viton seals, right? Also, it's necessary to machine this here so that the valve lift that you're going to use can be accommodated without the springs getting coil bind. This particular head here has had the spring seats machined, and with the spring used it will go 560 lift, which is what we're going to be using, and that will still leave about 30 thousandths of before coil bind. Also, we have machined these bosses down so that we can use screw-in studs on the heads instead of the pressed-in ones. Lastly, these bosses can also be machined a little lower than we've got here to take guide plates. However, we've elected to use the slots here for the guide plates, right? That's perfectly satisfactory so long as everything lines up. And we already know that it does because this head's been used before. In fact, this particular head that you're looking at here was ported by my friend Charlie down in the Miami area, and with me doing the chamber work on it and the machine work on here. Charlie's porting work is really top-notch. So if you're in the area, and his contact details will float by underneath here, then that would be a good guy to go to get a set of these heads if you didn't want to do them yourself. Also, and this is a useful asset, this area here has been, how shall I say, ported to allow the oil to drain back easier down that hole. It's been ground right up to here, right? And lastly, you'll see that we've got this now what's it called? It's electric armature enamel, right? You can usually get that from any place that really deals in electric motors, and some that don't. But anyway, now there's a point that I want to raise on it. Why do I use it? Well, two reasons. One, it makes the cylinder head look good, and remember, I'm in the business of selling books and having color photographs taken of my work. So that's one reason. Secondly, it seals the casting, right? And I say secondly, this casting was shot blasted to get it clean, right? Which is always a good way to clean up a casting. But if you're going to spray this electric armature enamel on there, it needs to be just fogged on. If it's put on too thick, it will peel off. And the other thing is it needs to be cured for several days. And what I normally do is put it on a radiator that's around about 160 degrees and leave it for 5 days, right? And then it's really hard. Do that, and if you sprayed it, fogged it onto a clean surface, it is not going to come off. Okay, here's the intake manifold face. You might be able to see a little bit of Charlie's expert port work there. But what I want to show you here is this corrosion around the water hole. Now, you can make this situation a lot better without having to go into the expense of machining this face. The holes here are usually a lot smaller than the gasket. So what I do here is put a gasket on and grind this hole out to match the gasket, and that gets rid of a lot of the corrosion, and it certainly doesn't hinder the water flow either. So that's a good move. As you can see though, there's still a bit of corrosion left, but with some of the gaskets you can go out further than that. So that's a good move. Again, it's a cosmetic move. It's not going to be important unless you're a really fussy guy, that's like me, or you're going to sell heads for a living. Well, that's like me as well. That done, now let's take a look at the business part of this video. That is making more horsepower. First off, and this is very important, see this area here has been flattened out, right? This is what I call a scavenge plateau, right? By cutting this out like this, we cause the scavenge action just at the end of the stroke, exhaust stroke, to be greatly enhanced. It isn't much, but it's very effective. There's a little tail here. Now I've been doing this for some years, right? Way back when, I think it was probably about 2001, 2002, Dick Bergen's magazine asked me to do a story on the then new Roush head that Roush did for World Products, right, which created quite a stir. And they did a nice job, but they only almost got it right. I remember opening the box and the first thing I saw was the chamber was not optimized, right? It did not have this plateau here. It had a conventional heart-shaped chamber. That is not the way to go. Doing this here on a head like this, if it made about 400 horsepower before, just cutting this plateau here will up that power to about 412 horsepower with no downside anywhere else in the lower RPM range. Also, it will extend the shift point by about 500 RPM, which means on the track it's worth far more than the 12 horsepower or so that you could expect to get from it, because you'll change gear that much later. Secondly, the exhaust seats here, now this is contrary to what the Cup cars are doing. The exhaust seats here are not 45-degree seats, nor are they 50 or 55, which is what the Cup car guys are doing. These are cut to 40 degrees, right? And what that does is it allows the cylinder to blow down faster because it presents area to the cylinder faster with a 40-degree seat than a 45. Now the beauty about this is, for the street or street strip, is if you cut the 40-degree seat, you do not need to have a dual pattern cam as much as you might have done with a regular seat. When I'm doing these 40-degree seats on engines, I typically don't use more than 2 to 4 degrees more exhaust, and if it's a real street motor, a single pattern cam. Now the other thing that's very difficult to see is the fact that these exhaust ports in the vicinity of the seat from about here up round to here are what I call area ruled. Now this is a term that I stole from the aircraft industry when area ruling the aircraft's wings and fuselage were the deal for supersonic aircraft. And that is going back probably before most of you were born. This would have been the mid-1950s when area ruling fuselages and wings was the big deal to get the plane to transition into the supersonic range without lots of buffeting and so on and so forth. Anyway, the way to do this is to use a flow ball that. Now, to area rule the exhaust, what we do is we use a flow ball. That's this device here, or object here. We put a valve in and we pull the flow ball up until it would just come out, and then we hold the valve in that position. Then we go around the valve like this and find out where it jams up and it can't come out. Wherever it can't come out, we then cut the cylinder wall to give it clearance. Right? Now, why are we doing this? It's because when the valve initially opens, the flow is supersonic. And the flow really doesn't care about what it saw on the flow bench. It's more sensitive to flow area than it is to flow coefficient. Now, obviously you can't cut it away everywhere because of the gasket line, but it is possible to undercut some of this here and give the valve more area, to the extent that for the first maybe 150 thousandths, the valve is not shrouded. That's another way to dump gases out the cylinder faster and thereby use less exhaust timing and make more low speed torque. Right, on to another move here. You'll notice that this area here is radiused, and this area here. Normally we see a straight sharp edge there. Well, what happens here is that the flow comes out of the intake port and it still has got to ride over this otherwise sharp edge. By rounding this off, we actually get a small increase in flow, right? And some of the flow goes there and then round. We also get an increase in swirl, which the Ford heads are deadly short of, especially these. Now, the other thing that we have going for us is that if we're running a tight quench, which we should be, this radius here allows the gases to infill that quench when the piston goes down, and this cuts pumping losses. The other thing you might notice here is the spark plug area, right? Now, this has been considerably cleaned up. It's not just cleaned up, it's shaped. If you look here, you'll see there's a radius here. Radius is radiused off everywhere. And the reason is when the swirl comes out of here, right, some of it goes down there and can swirl or tumble around this area here. Well, that's good. It kind of washes the exhaust out of there, but it needs to be able to get out easily as well to allow for a fresher charge in, right? And any exhaust that it's displacing needs to be able to get out and go out that exhaust there. Right, so there are the mods to the chamber that we need to consider. Now let's look at the valve. Right, let's just pop that valve in there. It's going to go in there. This front face here needs to be radiused into that there. You need a radius on there, right? Because as the piston comes up in the overlap period, molecules of exhaust which are very close to this face have to get squeezed out, and they have to go around this corner here. Well, if it's a sharp corner, they're not going to want to do that. They're going to want to move out like this and then interfere with the flow out here. Now, this is a small detail. It just gives us a little more flow at low lift, right? And the other thing it does is cut the temperature of the exhaust valve, which is always a good thing. Now, I think that most of you probably will not have seen any of those mods. What are they worth? If you do all these changes here, right, if you had a 400 horse motor before, then just the chamber mods I've discussed here will pump that up to probably close to 420. Oh, and there's one I forgot to talk about here, right? You need to try and keep a sharp edge here, but everywhere else around the exhaust, it needs to have a radius coming into that seat, right? And that's especially so to make it scavenge better. That you don't have to cut that radius on there. You can do that with your emery roll if you've got a steady hand. right? Well, that about wraps it up for today on this video, but I should point out there's a little more to it than just chamber mods here. If you really want to know about the technical side of cylinder head design and porting, I would suggest you attend one of my 3-day seminars, which is for people who want to be really serious about what they do here. If you want the tech and hands-on, then my 10-day seminar should be what you should target. With this, you'll get about 20% of the tech stuff, that's 2 or 3 days, and you'll have 7 or 8 days of hands-on work. Now, these are small group seminars, so basically everybody gets my personal attention. If you're interested in any of these seminars, just note what goes by on the bottom of the screen here. Go to my website and that will fill you in on the details. Thank you.